This is a story of what man has achieved in 50 years. We can record only the first chapter, the first 50 years. For it's a story of which all but the beginning has yet to be written. It opens with the opening of our own century, when King Edward VII was passing to his crowning through a gilt-edged world of gaslight and top hats. To the Englishman, the proper study of mankind was still the horse. True, technology was taking a sudden leap ahead. Coal and steam were under challenge. But even the new tooting electric tramway was somehow reassuring and familiar. Its wheels were firmly on the ground. Certainly, for many decades past, there had been signs and portents. There had been men like Lenardi, Sadler, Green, men impatient of an earthbound era, who had proved that hot air or gas enclosed within a fabric could carry them aloft. The balloonists were the first to overcome gravity. Born of the scientist's inquiry, in the hands of the showman, the balloon became a public spectacle. Sometimes, of course, gravity triumphed over the box office. But others, like the pioneer theorist Sir George Cayley, had been thinking differently. Henson, with his proposal for an aerial steam carriage. Stringfellow, building the first of all powered flying machines. Pilcher, developing a glider to be worn like harness on the human back. And those like Hargraves and Cody, who sought solutions in the kite. All were striving towards the same end, towards a means of obtaining sustained lift from outspread surfaces. Wilbur Wright and his brother Orville brought it all together. On December the 17th, 1903, the year our story opens, they left the ground at Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, in a motor-driven aeroplane. They flew for 284 yards. Powered flight had become reality. Now France began to take the lead. Santos Dumont, first flyer of the old world in his famous 14 bis. There was Voisin, too, his early seaplane glider braving the hazards of the Seine. It was this that led the way to a successful powered biplane. Santos Dumont again in 1908, exploring the monoplane with his Demoiselle. You could almost call it the first motorcycle of the air. Then in that same year, 1908, the intent, lean face of Wilbur Wright was seen in France. He came to show the old world what his aeroplane could do. He showed it this. A new dimension added to man's movement. Now the flyers could swoop above the fields. But what of the sea? What of the Channel? Latham in the Antoinette was first to try in 1909. To try and gallantly to fail. Engines were still unreliable. There was so much to learn. The next was Louis Blériot. He was the great exponent of the monoplane. the type that was to become the sporting, racing aircraft of the day. He took off from French soil on July the 25th, 1909, in a monoplane of his own build, the Blériot 11 bis, with an Anzani engine. Took off and conquered the Channel. From that day, they said, England ceased to be an island. Crossing the sea, the aeroplane crosses the threshold of public imagination. At the Reims meeting of 1909, one of the events is the champagne contest for distance. It's Poland with the Voisin versus Lefebvre in the right. And Latham in the Antoinette is there, making the record distance of 154 kilometers. None who were present have forgotten the excitement of those early meetings. Blackpool, Doncaster, Bournemouth, Brooklands, the quiver of taut fabric in the wind, the rotary engine and the reek of castor oil. There are aircraft in numbers now, and with numbers comes competition, and out of competition the great names emerge. Grace, Moore Brabazon, the Farmans, Ogilvy, Dixon, Coburn, Rolls. And then Graham White and the London to Manchester race of 1910, 186 miles. Confidently, Graham White takes off from Wormwood Scrubs. But at Rugby, the pocket windsocks are out. He's in trouble. Trees flirting with his undercarriage, in he comes. A final teeth-clenched lift, and he's safely down. But Graham White's luck is out. Quickly, he refuels. But Henri Farman sadly declares the undercarriage beyond repair, and Poland wins. Now the Daily Mail is offering £50 for a flight from London to Paris. Moisson wins the prize. In 1911, the aeroplane first showed what it could do as a means of transport. The Coronation Aerial Post from Hendon to Windsor. Hamill flew the first. And the mail got through. Then the airman's map was broadening out to international contests, like the Circuit of Europe. With flyers like Manton, Gordon Bell, Beaumont, and Robert Lorraine taking part. This is Hux adjusting his map. The monoplane men were in the lead, often flying Blériot aircraft. But in Britain, there came a check to the monoplane's development. A series of accidents due to structural failures led the War Office to impose a ban on single-wing machines. From that moment on, though the ban only lasted a few months, the biplane was to reign supreme for some 20 years. But the interest of the services was now aroused. That which could fly could fight. And at Lark Hill in 1912, Cody won the first prize at the military trials. But the most practical aircraft turned out to be the BE-2, designed by Geoffrey de Havilland. It was this biplane that was adopted as the official government military aircraft, to be developed by the government at an establishment later to become world-renowned. The Royal Aircraft Factory at Farnborough. But not without private competition. For the Sopwith tabloid was coming forward, first of a famous line of fighting aircraft. And 2 years later, a tabloid was on floats, The place, Monaco. The occasion, the Schneider Trophy race. The top speed, 86 miles an hour. It was the first time Britain took part, and she won. The pilot was Howard Pixton, and the year was 1914. Behind the trenches, behind the guns, behind the long lines of supply, a new word, a new force was coming into being. Air power. The first aeroplanes were warming up for war. Among them, the BE-2s and the early Farmans. Then came the single-seater Scouts, wooden, wire-braced biplanes like the Sopwith Pup. And from the same stable, the 1.5 Strutter, the first two-seater fighter. Then later came the Camel. Well named, it seemed, to bear the burden of long and furious combat hand-to-hand. Perhaps the most successful fighter of the First World War. It had a celebrated contemporary, too. Follen's SE-5 from Farnborough. Was this the first time in history, and the last, that an army charged with yesterday beneath it and tomorrow overhead? From the German aerodromes, the Fokkers rose, D-7s, surging in their formidable squadrons towards the Allied lines. The day of the dogfight and the aces, Bishop and Richthofen, Ball, Mannock, McCudden, Goering. The day when a man could become a legend in a few hours, in the fastest fighting that the world had known. And other purposes of war awaited aviation. For Britain, the adding of a new wing to her sea power was essential. The first experiments were made with Shorts and Sopwiths. Sometimes they succeeded. Sometimes they did not. Still, the trials went on. How to give the fleet a sharper eye, a longer arm. How to get an aircraft off the deck, into the air, onto the deck again. And if results were not to bear important fruit for many years, it was not for want of trying. Meanwhile, through the urgent days, with the U-boats tightening their hold, the short seaplanes carried on their sterling service on patrol. They were land-based, or, sweeping from the deck of a converted cruiser, they foreshadowed the carrier aircraft yet to come. And as the war years lengthened out, John Port's flying boats came down the ways at Felixstowe. Big seagoing machines whose descendants were to give Britain a great period of dominance in civil aviation later on. For a decade, Count Zeppelin had been developing the rigid airship. London was to grow familiar with his name. He was among the first to show that in a fighting world, there could be no more civilians. One bomb is answered by a larger, carried further, faster. On the Allied side as well, loads, ranges, speeds were growing. The FE-2B was one bomber that threw its shadow across the enemy lines. So it passed, the aeroplane's first war. By the end of it, the Sopwith Snipe was with the world's first air force, the RAF. And the big bomber was the Handley Page 0400. But perhaps the leaping progress of those years is best summed up in the aircraft you see here. Just 4 years had gone by, from the flimsy, almost defenseless farmers to the sturdy, warlike speed and lines of Barnwell's Bristol fighter. Before the palace railings, in the peace procession, in the silent mists of Scarpa and the Forth, one challenge ended, but in the air another opened, the world itself. Who, for instance, would conquer the Atlantic? The Americans made it first, in an NC-4 flying boat via the stepping stones of the Azores. But who, non-stop? Hawker and Mackenzie Grieve were the first to try. They mounted their attack from a field like a switchback in Newfoundland, in the Sopwith Atlantic. By sheer bad luck, due to no fault of plane or engine, they failed. Almost at once, all Cock and Brown decided that the time had come. Newfoundland again, west to east. But this time it was a Vickers Vimy. Eastward over 1,700 miles of empty sea, then suddenly dry land. And a rough and ready welcome in an Irish bog. On June the 14th, 1919, man was Admiral of the Ocean Air. So far, in its youthful years, the aeroplane had been bold, then bellicose, then brave. Now it became reliable. For in the year of the Atlantic, the RAF was flying the first scheduled aerial post. Hawkinge to Cologne was the route, with the mail for the occupation army. Hawkinge to Cologne, or was it Aix to Ghent? Helter-skelter through the sheep, over the wave tops, down among the turnips. But within hours instead of days, the watch on the Rhine had news of home. Reliable and then responsive. Just 16 years after Kitty Hawk, Holt Thomas's company was carrying the first passengers between Hounslow and Paris on the basis of a published timetable. Back over the trail of Louis Blériot. Then the years of fever floated in. The years of cocktails and cloche hats and flappers. Of Hobbs and Sutcliffe. Of the long lambando at Wimbledon. Of everyone at Wembley. The twitching 20s with the Charleston and Stepping Out and it. romantic years that saw the life and death of a demigod whose earthly name was Rudolph Valentino. There was the tension of the 20s too, unemployment and the fear of it. There was the Baldwin pipe, the MacDonald moustache, and a coming man called Ernest Bevin. In post-war perplexity, the wheels of industry might slow and stop. But there were other means of getting places, doing things, achieving thrills and spills and chills. There were other high roads to release, until in those tormented years, the most satisfying spectacle in all the world became the sight of objects being smashed to smithereens. No wonder that the 20s found earthbound civilians eager for the air. That this should be the period of the joyride and the 5-bob flip in machines like the old Avro 504. Yet behind it, for the world of flying, lay a sobering paradox. Planes of the past, released from war, enjoyed the public eye. But little new was stirring. And the aircraft industry itself stood uncertain in the aftermath. But in 1925, there came a sign. The first de Havilland Moth. And with this most famous light aeroplane, there came for the ordinary citizen, man or woman, the chance of serious study of the sky. The Moth made possible the weekend pilot and the flying club. And they, in turn, in word and deed, fostered that asset so vital to all nations in this century, the airfaring outlook. And at the same time, another side. The formation of Imperial Airways. Its aim, to open the British Empire to the air. Croydon and the old Argosy, the airliner par excellence of the late 1920s. The last to have an office open to the winds of heaven. Then the 30s brought a revolution in the HP-42. With her 4 engines, with her solid, stately shape, the nature of flight itself seemed to be transformed. The trilby and the briefcase, the fur coat and the hotel label are entering the airman's world. Perhaps already something of the tang of adventure is passing. The air's becoming part and parcel of society, business, diplomacy. Departure has become a ceremonial. And the airman himself is changing too. In the covered cockpit, the leather coat has become the captain's uniform. Gold braid is at the controls, experienced, reassuring. The long ship has become the galleon. And the aids and disciplines are with us now, the control tower and radio navigation. A merchant fleet is aloft, and it has to know with reasonable accuracy where the devil it is. So Hannibal, Hanno, and their kind drove back the horizons. Always a little further. First Arabia, then on to India. And great aircraft they were. Through all their years of service, they never lost a passenger. They were still flying in the Second World War. Their cruising speed in still air was less than 100 miles an hour. Yet they put Sharjah across the road from Cheltenham. The Schneider Trophy. We had won it already, and we wanted it again. 1925, the Supermarine S4. In 1927, Mitchell and Webster ensured victory for Britain at Venice. 2 years earlier, the S4, one of the first strutless cantilever aircraft, had lost to the Americans. But now the S5 was sweeping opposition aside at 281 miles an hour. 1929. The year of the S6, and victory again. Speed, 328.6. (1931). And the blue and silver skims the spray once more. Now the speed is up to 340. And the winner is the S6B with a Rolls-Royce engine. She is one of the most significant aircraft of these first 50 years. We shall hear of her and see her lines again. In the meantime, she and John Boothman have won the trophy outright for Britain. There was speed to be developed, but there was space to be conquered too. And during all these post-war years, the long-distance flyers had been battering at the walls of distance. Ross and Keith Smith to Australia in 1919 in their Vimy. Bert Hinkler, Croydon to Darwin in 15.5 days. Cobham to Cape Town and to India. And that great moving spirit, Sir Sefton Branca. The Southern Cross with her fine Australian pilot, Kingsford Smith. Mollison, professional record buster. Gino Watkins, cracking the ageless silence of the Arctic. And back in 1927, there was a high-wing monoplane filled with fuel to bursting, climbing heavily above Long Island, vanishing from view. 33 hours later, Charles Lindbergh had flown non-stop New York to Paris, into the headlines of the nations, into the fable of the times. His plane was more than the spirit of St. Louis. She was the spirit that made aviation part of the fabulous productive enterprise of the United States. There were many women pioneers as well, among them Amy Johnson. She came home from her England to Australia flight in an Argosy with a fitting escort of D.H. Moss, aircraft of the type that had served her so well. Most of the long-distance pioneers have gone, but they opened a new age in powered flight. It was a race now for the long-haul commerce of the sky. Among the early entrants was Germany. Her huge Doe X crowding on sail with its 12 engines, on one occasion lifting 170 people. The German lighter-than-air school was still strong. And in the Graf Zeppelin, Dr. Eckner believed he had the new liner of the sky. But German hopes of the dirigible were to end in horror at Lakehurst, New Jersey, when the Hindenburg was coming to her moorings. Wholly different was Britain's approach to regular long-distance flight. All along, she had been interested in the flying boat. There was Mitchell's Supermarine Southampton and Gouge's Short Singapore and his civilian Calcutta. Along these lines seemed to lie the answer to the serving of a maritime commonwealth, to flying between countries separated by oceans, whose maps were dotted with harbors, lakes, and rivers. So evolved Canopus and the short C-class Empire flying boat. Many passengers still believe they were the most comfortable aircraft ever built. And many still look back nostalgically to that moment of anticipation before takeoff, when you looked ahead to a leisured flight, to the night stops at Luxor, to the mosquitoes at Lumbo, to the sight of Lake Victoria or Karangi Creek beneath the wingtip float. Days, under the all-up Empire airmail scheme these boats made possible, one could send a letter to any country of British association for a penny halfpenny. They pioneered the North Atlantic route, too. Caledonia over New York in 1938, just a little bigger in size than the Mayflower. Most significant in the 30s was the Douglas DC-2, the aircraft whose successor, the DC-3, became the workhorse of the world. In 1934, there was a race from Mildenhall to Melbourne for the £10,000 McRobertson Prize. One entrant was a de Havilland plane flown by Scott and Campbell Black and called, prophetically, the Comet. Another was a DC-2, owned by KLM. The winner was the Comet, but second came the DC-2, with a full load of passengers and mail, with her stressed skin, flaps, retractable undercarriage, variable pitch propellers. She heralded the land-plane future of transport aviation. A side chute from the main stem, the C-30 Autogyro. Unlike the helicopters, her rotors were a means of support only, not also of propulsion. Here, said her protagonists, was the answer to the runway problem. The aeroplane was taking off into the fourth decade of its life. Across the Atlantic, America's passenger aircraft were rising to supremacy, still secure behind their ocean frontiers. But over Europe, the clouds were gathering, and much of Britain's aviation energy was going into military and naval design. The early experiments with seaborne fighting planes had paid off now. The Fleet Air Arm was in being. Every year, thousands flocked to Hendon to crick their necks as the Royal Air Force displayed its paces. The biplane still held the sky. In those days, the RAF was very much the youngest and the smallest of the services. But even then, we marveled at the quality that was going into its equipment. into the Hawker Harts and Furies, into the Virginias and the Hayfords. In 1935, the RAF held a great review to mark the jubilee of King George V. Among the fighters that took part were the Gloucester Gladiators, still flying and fighting 7 years later over Malta. It was a great occasion and a great farewell. 23 years before, when the monoplane was banned, the biplane had come to the fore. It had held the forefront ever since. Now it was gradually to vanish. And these formations were its swan song. Over Europe, the clouds were gathering. And a Junkers 52 was carrying a new proponent of Machtpolitik towards the onset of another war. Remember the rumors and the fear of the unknown. Remember the discouraged words, "There is no defense against air attack." And do you remember this? The S-6B at the Schneider Trophy of 1931, it was she that changed it all. For in the years between, she had become the Spitfire with the Merlin engine. There she is, and there her descendant. Does history record the like? One piece of engineering changing the hopes of a nation, changing perhaps the destiny of half the world. So the aeroplane entered its second war. Not now as the plaything of tradition, but as the spearhead of a new concept of attack, derived, as many believe, from the whirlwind tactics of the Mongols. Blitz. Warsaw, Rotterdam, northern France. And then he took the road that Blériot had taken exactly 31 years before. This time with Heinkels, Dorniers, Messerschmitts. Waiting for them were the Spitfires, and more important at the time, the greater numbers of the Hurricanes. The Battle of Britain. Of the human element, the Prime Minister of the day wrote a few words of a few men into the heritage of the English-speaking world. Of their incomparable equipment, perhaps this summary will suffice. Hurricane, Spitfire, Merlin, radar. Of the significance of the outcome, this. It was the first battle of history in which the issue of invasion was settled without the movement of a soldier in the air. Air power had abolished the civilian, but the man in the street had his own reply. ARP could take it too. But how to strike back? There wasn't much to strike back with in those early days, but there was F for Freddy and A for Apple, the Wellingtons, choosing each dusk their target for tonight. Far out over the western approaches, the Sunderlands of Coastal Command were operating. They too came from a peacetime design, the C-class Empire flying boats. They watched over the convoys 12 hours at a stretch. For Britain was still an island fortress, and much was going on inside. It had begun with Whittle's Cranwell thesis in 1926. For a long time, there hadn't been much encouragement, and there simply weren't the materials that would stand up to the temperatures. But now, things were really moving, until, in the Gloucester E-2839, the first British aircraft to be powered by a gas turbine left the ground. It was 1941 when the sound of a turbojet was heard over English fields. The German answer on a parallel principle, Vergeltungswaffe, better known at the receiving end as V1. The flying bomb, or just those things. If Whittle could dispense with propellers, Goering could dispense with pilots. But they had to be fought by men. And to begin with, by piston-engine planes. But then the first of the Meteors were after them. And jet met jet in combat. All the while, the relentless growth of the bomb and the means of delivering it. By day, American fortresses and liberators. By night, British Lancasters, Halifaxes, Stirlings. First, the Pathfinders, then the incendiaries and the blockbusters. As the Fury mounted, as the fighters and the bombers and the fighter-bombers prepared the coast of Europe for invasion, the camera gun became the only method swift enough to record the aircraft's powers of devastation. Typhoons and mosquitoes, improved cannon and new rockets, smashing supplies, shooting up trains, sinking the ships that supplied the trains. dawn of the air came the airborne divisions in their formations of Horsa gliders, in their troop-carrying Dakotas, self-contained, self-supplied. Armies marching on silk. Far away around the globe in the inter-island vastness of the Pacific, the carriers had long since replaced the battleships as the capital striking force of the American Navy. Now they were closing in with double mobility, fighting off the blind desperation of the Zeros and the kamikazes. And then the ultimate, or what seemed the ultimate. Hiroshima was 41 years and 8 months after Kitty Hawk. The United Nations, meeting beneath a symbol new to mankind, the symbol of the world created by the aeroplane, the great undivided circle. The pent-up years were past. The traffic of this new world was on the wing, and the equipment was American. During the war, her tremendous capacity had enabled her to maintain her development of transport aircraft. Here were the results. Everywhere, Dakotas, Convairs, DC-4s, Constellations. Britain's effort had been going only into fighting aircraft, and the York showed how much ground she'd lost. The York and the Lancastrian, bombers in civilian clothing. But that was several years ago. At the turn of the half-century, Britain salutes the aircraft that put her in the lead again. The aircraft and the men. Walker, Hagg, and Bishop. The Short brothers. Folland, Carter, and those others who turned pipe dreams into shape and speed. Sopwith, Hawker, Segrist, Cam, Mitchell, Scott Payne, Byrd, Pearson and Edwards, Rowe, Chadwick, Dobson. Handley Page and Volkert. These and 100 others who kept their heads firmly in the clouds. Here is the sober product of the sound and fury, the first true airliners of this age of the Great Circle. The Comet. The Viscount with her 4 propeller turbines. Russell's Britannia, the great 100-seater. The Bristol 173, looking for all the world like the rail car of tomorrow. Years of powered flight. When the Wright brothers rose from the fields of North Carolina, Heathrow was a village beyond the outskirts of London in the county of Middlesex. On this site now stands London Airport. As always, the final triumph lies in organizing the miracle into the daily commonplace. 50 years of courage, devotion, genius. And this is only the beginning, the opening chapter in the story of our century. How will the second open? Shall we do without the air itself? We seem about to penetrate its envelope. If so, flight may show to human eyes a truth even greater than its own technology. That the world is whole as well as round, and very small.